is not going to be a talk that will present a fantastic solution or a magic bullet to a pressing problem. Instead, I will present a conundrum that I've been struggling with as a young African. A conundrum that I believe many of you and many other Africans are also facing. While I will offer areas of possible intervention, I'm also hoping that those watching and listening across the world will be able to do the same with me. I admit I am stuck and I need your help. I am reaching out to invite you all in this significant moment in the lives of hundreds of millions of Africans to interrogate Africa's past, present, and future, and to interrogate how we're going about building this Africa. Let me give you some context. The early 2000s were a fantastic time in Nairobi, very hopeful. The one-party dictatorship of Daniel Toroitich arap Moi, who had been president since the 1970s, came at the end of the Cold War, and there was a return to multi-party politics in the 1990s, and there was an end to his dictatorship in 2002. There were limited returns to agricultural goods due to the economic downturn of the 1970s, and in the 1980s, there were structural adjustment programs that followed. However, this was replaced by improving economic conditions and debt forgiveness. This changing circumstances opened up opportunities for the elites and the middle class to grow, but also created a population influx into the cities and a growing gap between the rich and the poor. These political, economic, and social changes that Nairobi was going through were perfectly captured in a few moments as my family and I sat in our second-hand Toyota, waiting for the light to change in the city center. My mother was driving, and I was sitting beside her, and my sister was in the back seat. It was a hot afternoon, so we had our windows down, and my mother and I were involved in some type of discussion. Out of nowhere, a slightly disheveled young boy, who must have been about 10 years old, walked up to my mother's window, holding human feces, and threatened to throw it at her unless she gave him money. I don't quite remember exactly what happened in those tense moments, but I recall that my mother was calm and did not raise any alarm. These incidents were common at the time. The public toilets that the city council had built were not regularly cleaned, and Nairobians had been exchanging stories in their living rooms about how to escape the situation unharmed. In those tense moments, I remember thinking that, how will we end up getting this bad smell off our clothes? How will we end up cleaning our car? Perhaps we'll have to get it professionally cleaned. For some reason, the possibility that my mother would actually hand over money did not occur to me. The next thing I knew, my mother had accelerated and sped off. Later, I remember thinking that maybe the light must have changed as I was wandering, and my mind wandered. And even though I was full of fear, I had somehow escaped. Years later, when I was older, I wanted to share this shitty story with my friends. But I hesitated. By then, I was in developed countries, and I was outside the continent, and I knew that telling this story would only make Africans look bad. After all, these are the same spaces where people, in all seriousness, ask me, do you keep pets as wild animals? Do you live in trees and huts? Do you live in some kind of poverty that somehow makes you so weak you cannot swat off a fly from your lip? This story would have only served to confirm problematic stereotypes, even if I tried to carefully couch it in some type of explanation, some type of contextual understanding of the social and political instances that led to what happened. Well, at least that was the rational explanation I gave myself. While it was true, it was only much more recently that I came to realize that there was a more nuanced reason for this hesitation. I was unsure of myself, not only because I was young, but also because I did not know what was expected of a young African in the 21st century. When I talk to my friends and my families and my colleagues and my students, I realize that I'm not the only one undergoing this identity crisis. We're apparently involved in a debate on what we Africans need to be, what we need to give up, what we need to do for us to take our rightful place on the world stage. What do we need to do to become McKinsey's lions on the move? Or to realize the battle cry, African solutions to African problems? What does it mean for us to feel vindicated, respected, and no longer dependent and self-sufficient? What does it mean for Africa to rise? And what is my role in that? So far, it seems like we have two options. On one hand, we need to become modern, developed, and to achieve it, we need to give up our backward traditional practices. We need to become more formal, we need to become more high-tech. We need to celebrate the markers of development and progress, the skyscrapers, the highways, the weaves, the suits, and the apps. Let's not forget the apps. On the other hand, we're told that we have lost our way by seeking these markers of modernity, and we need to go back to our roots. We need to return to the traditional grains like sorghum and millet, because all this modern food is making us sick. We need to wear kitenge and dashikis made of kanga, and let go of that relaxer and leave our natural hair out and proud. The story of those moments at that Nairobi bus stop made it very clear that I was unsure of what narrative, what caricature I was supposed to live up to in order to contribute to Africa's promising reality. Would I choose this version of modernity, the skyscrapers and such? Or would I choose a version of authenticity with my natural hair? Now, there are many problems that come along with this type of choice, right? First of all, this is a lot of pressure. I'm not only supposed to be the first person in my nuclear family to go to university, but also apparently I'm supposed to represent 1.2 billion Africans. Second of all, some of you, I'm sure, who are talking with me or listening to me, you've already realized that there is some form of a false dichotomy that I've created. That the choice I've presented is not quite as dire as it is. While I understand this, and will address it later, we cannot deny that these caricatures and the assumptions that they're based on create large parts of the reality that we live in every day. Let me show you what I mean. From a young age, my middle-class upbringing meant that I was on the path to university. University was important because it meant I would be part of the 20 to 40% of Africa's labor force who end up in the formal sector as policymakers, civil servants, doctors, nurses, bankers, and other professionals. It's not easy to become part of this group of professionals. First, you have to hope that you're not part of the 20% of African children aged 6 to 11 who never have access to school. Then, you have to find a way to make sure that you're not part of the 33% of 12 to 14-year-olds who either never complete primary school or do not end up joining secondary school. If that's not enough, you also have to figure out how to not be part of the 60% of 15 to 17-year-olds who never complete high school. If all of that works out, and you can afford it, then you'll be part of the 7% of Africans who are able to pursue higher education. And just when you thought you were all set, you realize that there's actually up to a 50% chance that you will not be able to get a job even if you go to university. So you have to hope that you live in South Africa or Mauritius, where you have a 6 or 8%, we only have a 6 or 8% chance of not finding a job, compared to, let's say, Ghana and Tunisia, where you have a 41 and 50% chance of not getting a job if you're a university graduate. And so, whether by luck, by wealth, by hard work, or by some combination of all these things, you end up in this select group of professionals in the formal sector. This, however, leaves us with the 60 to 80% who end up in the informal sector. These are the farmers, the market women, the day laborers, the builders, the metal workers. These are the people who we professionals either pity because of their dire circumstances and suffering, or we deride for their failures. We say things like, that ethnicity is backward. They don't value education. Their parents didn't emphasize the importance of education, so they chose to graze cattle or dig instead. They refused to work hard. They failed their exams. They played around and they got pregnant. Beyond these statements, we go on to praise the many truly gifted people and institutions that have come up with innovative solutions to help these poor informal people through their education journey. So we come up with innovations like investments in schools and education infrastructure. We make sure we add career training and secondary school education and university education. We make sure that we encourage self-employment and entrepreneurship by allotting funds to youth, to women, and other vulnerable people. Through these interventions, these poor, unfortunate, ignorant, lazy 60 to 80% can be uplifted, can be civilized, can be developed. Now, what does all this have to do with writing Africa's future and building it? Well, whether by the laws that we pass or the policies that we enforce, whether it is through the license and tax-paying economic activities that we run, through the curriculum that we write and teach, or through the prescriptions that we give, we, the 20 to 40% of professionals, have so far been tasked with actively writing Africa's future. This future is bounded by the same narrow definitions that have created us. These definitions are shaped by denying, by delegitimizing, by demonizing certain aspects of the African reality, those that we call informal. But we do take the time to tokenize the few who are able to make that crossing from the informal to the formal. Within these narrow definitions of modernity and development, we see ourselves as heroes, as civilizers, as signs of Africa's prosperous future. Through our words and our actions, we make it clear to non-professionals that they are not equipped to actively write Africa's future. They're living a reality that must be changed. They do not fit. They're a collection of wants and needs. They need to be empowered. They need to be clothed. They need to be educated. They need to be fed. They need to be healed. They need to be trained to become some version of professionals. These beliefs are so internalized that parents tell their children not to be like them. There is no future in being like me. There's no future in being like us, in following the ways that came before us. So we accept that progress lies in changing to become this version of modernity. He went to the city. She went to America. At best, the modernity that we live, that we champion, was fashioned by a small group of elites who participated in creating these definitions. At worst, these definitions, these modern standards we aspire to, were created by others, sometimes imposed, and other times willingly adopted. As you can see and are no doubt aware, these are serious and complex issues that are occupying the hearts and minds and the visions and missions of political movements and institutions on the continent and across the globe. But even as we acknowledge these initiatives, it is clear that we have put a lot of eggs in this modernization basket, and we need to make sure that we are, or at least find that we have not put or gotten the resources that we wanted from that basket. We listened when we were told that all the things needed to change for us to be modern and developed. We built entire systems and economies, invested millions, if not billions, of US dollars on the assumption and the expectation that by creating these pathways, our young people will end up as part of this group of professionals. They will work in offices. They will dress in suits. They will drive cars. They will live in 3-bedroom houses with quarters in the back for the help. They will have health insurance. They will travel for their holidays. They will enjoy all these perks of being modern. Some of us realized or came to the conclusion that this panacea of modernity was too good to be true, not worth all the changes that were expected. And so we chose to go to the so-called wisdom of those who came before us. And so we incorporate traditional architecture into our homes. We revert back to farming. We champion our natural hair secrets. Between these two caricatures is where most of us live. Constantly negotiating our Africanness, trying to live within these narrow definitions that are presented, definitions that many of us live by, but never have the time or the opportunity to interrogate. If we continue on this path that we're on, most of the continent's population will continue to be locked out of the process of being able to participate meaningfully in constructing these definitions because they're considered too needy or too ill-equipped to participate. We also cannot go back to the past because very few people who were alive then are alive now. And we cannot unlearn what we have learned, what we have seen, what we have heard, what we have eaten. All such an approach would do is create a restrictive fundamentalism that would create a painful and violent reality, especially to those who are most vulnerable in society. So, what do we do now that we find ourselves in this conundrum? Do we ride this modernity train and take it wherever it takes us? Or do we hop over to the one that takes us back to our roots? Or do we change the terms of the discussion altogether and rise above the dichotomy that is before us? If we pick the third one, then one question we can ask ourselves is, what does deliberate and inclusive discussion of Africa's future look like? If there are deliberate discussions happening already, let us ask, where are they happening? In government offices, in parliaments and cities, at civil society conferences, in academic journals, in summits hosted in European cities, in languages and vocabulary only understood by a select group of people? Is it in auditoriums such as these, where people pay for the opportunity to hear great thinkers and innovators tell us their big ideas? If so, if we agree that perhaps they are deliberate but not inclusive, then we should go on and ask, what would it look like if we were more inclusive in these conversations? What if agronomists told farmers that the wisdom of practices such as crop rotation and mixed farming and seed exchanges actually correlates with scientific findings, and together come to address the issue of food security on the continent and across the globe? What if economists and manufacturers and lorry drivers and shopkeepers and market women came together on a regular basis to explore and understand economic behavior in a given community? What if the discussions about the investments in human resources for health actually recognized and included the thousands of women and girls who every year sacrifice their labor for others in the home? What if ideas worth spreading were hosted in homes, in local halls, in football pitches, in churches and mosques, advertised on the radio, through local leaders and influencers, and were led by your neighbors and your brothers and sisters? What if?